So, we've already talked about the need for a transport system, especially in larger, more complex organisms. We've talked about the fluid medium, the blood, that moves all of those nutrients and oxygen and carbon dioxide and other minerals and waste around. And we've talked about the transport system that helps move that fluid medium or that blood around. But the final thing that we've yet to talk about is the thing that books are written about, that songs are written about, that a holiday's been named after, and that even bands are named after. And that is, of course, the pump for this transport system, the heart. So the heart itself is a muscular organ. It's made up of a specialized type of muscle tissue that we call cardiac muscle. It's about the size of your fist, doesn't weigh a whole heck of a lot, 300 to 500 grams depending on the individual, and it's located right in the center of the chest. And I know we tend to think about the heart being on the left side, and I suppose in a way it kind of is, or at least a little bit more to the left. It kind of tilts a little bit more to the left side of that thoracic cavity. And in fact, if you take a look at the lungs, you'll notice that there's a depression in the lung, or at least a cavity on the left side of the lung to accommodate this left-leaning heart. So as we take a look at an external representation of the heart here, we can see that there's a lot of musculature, and that makes sense, the heart being a muscular organ. And we can see that there's a lot of blood vessels, be them veins or arteries, and that's because the heart, being primarily muscle, requires a lot of oxygen and produces a lot of carbon dioxide. That is, it utilizes a lot of blood. So as a result, the heart actually has its own coronary circuit, that is a circuit of blood that the heart pumps to itself and pumps back from itself to feed the active muscles. In addition, it's surrounded by a pericardium, which is a fluid-filled sac that allows the heart to beat and lowers the friction inside the thoracic cavity. Now, if we were to take a look at the internal anatomy of the heart, we would notice that it's separated into 4 chambers. Depending on the complexity of the organism, we can have hearts that are kind of just acting as a pump. We have some that may have a couple of chambers. We may have some that even have 3 chambers. But of course, as we can see here, ours is separated into 4. And depending on how you look at it, you can separate it further into the atria and the ventricles, or you can separate it into left and right, as we are going to do, taking a look at the primarily deoxygenated blood that comes in and the oxygenated blood that is then going to leave the heart. So before we go any further, we have to be clear on left and right. If you're looking at a diagram of the heart, or if you're looking at a diagram really of anything in terms of human anatomy, we have to remember that we are looking at it from a straight-on view. That is, as we look at that individual, we are going to see their right side on our left and their left side on our right. So when we talk about the right side of the heart, it's going to appear on the diagram or the computer screen as being on the left, but we have to understand the orientation of the diagram and understand that that is in fact the right side of the heart that we're taking a look at. So as we find ourselves in the right atrium, the blood is then going to move from the right atrium through one of the valves. These valves are in between the atrium and the ventricle, so we refer to these as atrioventricular valves. This valve is also sometimes known as the tricuspid valve, at least on the right side, because of these characteristic 3 flaps that represent the valve on this side. So the blood then moves into the right ventricle. Now, all along the right side, we have to keep in mind that this blood is deoxygenated. It's come back from the systemic circuit. It's come back from the body tissues that have utilized most of the oxygen and have replaced it with carbon dioxide. So you'll notice on these flaps, we have these little cords or tendons that are coming off here. We call these chordae tendinii, and these are what we more commonly call the heartstrings. And their job, their role, is to support the valves and prevent any backflow from the ventricle back into the atrium. Now what I want you to notice when we take a look at this is the musculature, the thickness of the layers between the atria and the ventricle. And if we think about their purpose, that kind of makes sense. The atria only have to pump next door, so to speak. That is, they've only got to move the blood from the atrium itself to the neighboring ventricle. The ventricle, though, has to pump blood externally from the heart. And in the case of the right ventricle, it's going to pump it out through these semilunar valves and into the lungs. So this is what we refer to as the pulmonary circuit. That is the circuit that goes from the heart to the lungs. Now, blood is going to leave through the pulmonary artery. So we have to keep in mind here that this is the pulmonary artery that we're going through, and it has deoxygenated blood. So that's why when we were talking about blood vessels, I said don't get in your head that all arteries contain oxygenated blood, because in this case they don't. Remember, arteries are those vessels that leave the heart. So in this case, it's taking a blood away from the heart, but the blood itself is deoxygenated. So when the blood gets to the lungs, as we know, oxygen is exchanged for carbon dioxide, and the blood comes back through the pulmonary veins into the heart, but it is oxygenated. So the veins in this case now in the pulmonary circuit are carrying oxygenated blood. So as the blood enters the heart, again, this time it enters into the left atrium. We are going to pass through the left atrioventricular valve, which in this case is known as the bicuspid or mitral valve, and now we are going to enter into the left ventricle. Notice here the musculature of the left ventricle is even more significant than the musculature in the right ventricle, and that's because in this case, this ventricle has to pump blood to the entire body rather than just to the neighboring lungs. So the musculature on this side is significantly greater than it is on the right side. You'll notice in addition that there is a muscular septum that separates the right ventricle from the left ventricle to prevent blood mixing. So let's just stop and talk about the valves for a second. The valves, opening and closing, give rise to the characteristic sound of a heartbeat. And those two noises that you hear we refer to as the lub and dub portions of the heartbeat. Now these have to do with the opening and closing of the valves. More specifically, the lub has to do with the closing of the atrioventricular valves, and the dub, the louder sound that you hear of the two, that one has to do with the closing of the semilunar valves. So as blood rushes in from the atrium to the ventricle, and that valve closes, that's when we hear the lub. As the blood moves from the ventricle, the closing of the semilunar valves is what we refer to as the dub portion of that heartbeat. Now, if you've ever had your blood pressure taken, you will have had your blood pressure taken by a blood pressure monitor, or scientifically what we refer to as a sphygmomanometer, and it could look like this, or it could look like this, or I guess it could look like this. But either way, what it's going to give you is a reading of when the blood pressure is at its highest and when the blood pressure is at its lowest. And this corresponds to the heartbeat as well. You see, when the blood is at its lowest, we refer to this as diastole. And this is when the blood is going from the atrium and filling the ventricles. That's when the blood pressure is at its lowest. When we move into systole, when the systolic pressure is measured, we are going to be in the stage of that heart function where the ventricle is contracting and the blood is moving forcefully out to the lungs or to the rest of the body. So the systole and diastole of the heart cycle corresponds to the systolic pressure and diastolic pressure read by the sphygmomanometer. The blood is then pumped through the semilunar valves into the aorta, which is the major artery leaving the heart. It branches off from there depending on whether it's going to the upper body or lower body or to the heart itself, and then the blood progresses to the systemic circuit and to the rest of the body. So here's a little thought exercise for you. I want you to think of something that you own or something in your house that has worked non-stop, tirelessly, without repair or replacement every single day since the day you were born. In fact, it might have even worked even before you were born. Is that same thing going to work 5 years from now? 10? 50? What did you come up with? Was it an electronic? Was it an automobile? Was it an appliance? Well, you do have something that's with you that has worked and should continue to work under the right circumstances and if you take care of it. Every single day of your life, 80 years or more, tirelessly, 365, 24/7, pumping 5 liters of blood up to 25 liters of blood every minute, depending on not whether you're exercising, and that is, of course, the heart. You see, the heart's always working. Now, it's unique. It's made up of, as I already said, myogenic muscle. But what does that mean? Well, myogenic muscle is unique because it actually contracts on its own. It doesn't need signals from the nervous system. But if all of that heart muscle were just to twitch randomly, there wouldn't be much coordinated action. So as a result, we actually do need a natural pacemaker to control the electrical impulses and the contraction of that heart muscle. And we do, of course, have that. Now, the heart's natural pacemaker is a specialized bundle of cells that are located here in the right atrium. We call this the SA node or the sinoatrial node. And it generates electrical impulses that cause the atria to contract, but it also sends these impulses to another specialized bundle of cells that we call the AV node or atrioventricular node. Now, the AV node slows the electric current so that the atria have full time to contract before it sends the signals down something called the Purkinje system, which then ultimately causes the ventricles to contract. So, between the SA node and the AV node, they're sending out electrical signals to cause the atria and the ventricles to contract rhythmically, so that the atria contract at the same time and the two ventricles contract at the same time. Now, even if this is the first time that you've been exposed to the idea of electrical impulses within the heart, it's probably not the first time that you've been exposed to the imagery of electrical impulses in the heart. You see, the diagram behind me is what you refer to as an electrocardiogram, or more commonly an ECG or an EKG. Now, what this can help do is determine appropriate heart function, and is especially important for those individuals who have arrhythmias or an improper heartbeat, or if we have had individuals that have had heart attacks previously, or if we're monitoring the pacemakers, the artificial pacemakers that have been placed into a patient to see that they're functioning properly. So hopefully after watching this video, in fact, hopefully after watching this series of videos on the circulatory system, you better understand the need for a transport system, especially in increasingly complex organisms. You understand the need for the fluid component, or the blood, in order to transport materials needed for proper body function. We understand that there has to be passageways to transport that fluid medium, to transport that blood. And of course, we have to have a means of moving that blood through those transport vessels, and that is of course the heart. And there is one last thing that I should mention about the heart. While it is fairly self-contained in terms of the control of the heartbeat and the heart rate, your nervous system has several components that do impact it. Such is the case when you panic and have to flee, the fight or flight response, or when your heart rate increases because of that special someone, or maybe when you hear that special song. Thanks for watching.